A locked room, oil lamps flickering against stone walls. A man stands in the center, palms open, dark marks visible in both hands. Wounds still open. Across the room, another man stares at those hands, frozen. The room is silent except for breathing. These are the hands he said he needed to see. Have you ever been the only person in the room who didn't feel it? Everyone around you came back from something, a service, a retreat, a moment that shook them, and they were trembling with certainty. Eyes wet, voices cracking, and you stood there with nothing. They couldn't explain it well enough, and you couldn't manufacture it. The gap between their experience and your silence grew wider every time they tried. That's where this story begins. 10 of your closest friends tell you they've seen a dead man alive. They're shaking with joy. You weren't there. You're getting it all secondhand. The tears, the breathless insistence, and something in you just can't. Before we circle back to that locked room and those open hands, we need to talk about a man who heard the most extraordinary news of his life from his closest friends. And his answer was no. It's Jerusalem, the week after Passover. The city is emptying out, pilgrims returning to their villages, merchants packing up their stalls. But this year is different. Roman soldiers patrol in tighter formations than usual, watching every corner. A rabbi named Jesus had been publicly executed 3 days earlier, and the authorities, both Roman and Jewish, are on high alert for any sign of unrest among his followers. The disciples had scattered when Jesus was arrested. Peter denied even knowing him 3 times to strangers around a fire. The others simply ran. But somehow, in the days that followed, they'd regrouped behind a locked door in an upper room somewhere in the city. Not to organize, not to spread word, to survive. The room was small. Stone walls, low ceiling, narrow windows sealed with cloth to keep any light from leaking out. Oil lamps burned through the night, casting restless shadows. The air was thick with sweat, stale bread, lamp oil, and something heavier. The particular kind of fear that settles in your chest when the people who killed your teacher know your face. What they'd witnessed on Friday was behind their eyes every time they closed them. Roman crucifixion was not a quick death. It was engineered to be slow, public, and humiliating. The condemned were stripped, nailed through wrists and feet, and suspended so that every breath became a fight against their own collapsing weight. It could take hours, sometimes days. Thomas carried those sounds, the hammer striking iron, the desperate gasping for air that slowed and thinned until it stopped, the silence after. Every one of them held those memories in that locked room, pressed against the stone walls, breathing the same stale air. Jewish mourning in the 1st century followed a specific rhythm. The first 7 days, called Shiva, were devoted to raw grief. Mourners sat on low seats, tore their garments, and received visitors who came to share the weight. But these disciples couldn't mourn properly. The man they grieved had been executed as a criminal by Rome. To grieve him openly could mark you for the same fate. Their grief itself was a crime. For 3 years they'd followed him, leaving boats, tax booths, families behind, convinced he was the Messiah who would liberate Israel and overthrow Roman occupation. They had expected a king. Instead, they watched him die between 2 thieves on a Roman cross outside the city walls. Their entire identity had collapsed with him. Then Sunday evening came. Jesus appeared in the locked room without opening any door, simply there, standing among them. He showed them his hands and his side. The text says they were transformed from terror to joy in a single moment. 10 men witnessed it. But Thomas wasn't there that night. The gospel never explains why, where he went, what pulled him away. That silence in the text speaks louder than the other 10's celebration. For 2,000 years, Thomas has been defined by a single moment of doubt, one instance of skepticism that's overshadowed everything else the gospel reveals about him. But who he actually was before that locked room tells a completely different story. Earlier in John's Gospel, when Jesus decides to return to Judea, a place where people had recently tried to stone him, the other disciples hesitate. Too dangerous, they say. Too soon. But Thomas doesn't hesitate. He steps forward and tells the others they should go with Jesus so they can die with him. That's not a doubter talking. That's a man volunteering for death while the others are still calculating the risk. At the Last Supper, when Jesus speaks cryptically about going away to prepare a place and the disciples knowing the way, the room goes silent. Nobody asks what he means. Everyone sits with their confusion. Except Thomas. He's the only one honest enough to say what the whole room is thinking. We don't know where you're going. How can we know the way? This is Thomas's pattern. He shows up. He speaks when others stay silent. He asks the questions everyone else is afraid to ask. He might actually be the most honest person in the room. But on the night of the resurrection, the most important night in history, Thomas wasn't there. The gospel doesn't explain where he went or why he left. Maybe the grief in that room was suffocating, and he needed to walk alone through the dark streets with what Friday had done to him. Some people grieve in community. Others need silence. In first-century Jewish culture, separating yourself from the group during mourning was unusual, almost a rupture. His absence was its own kind of breaking. Whatever the reason, Thomas missed the moment that transformed the others. That absence would define him for 2,000 years, not as the brave one, not as the honest one, but as the one who wasn't there. When he returned, everything had shifted. The 10 disciples were radiating something Thomas couldn't recognize. Joy where grief should be, certainty where confusion should be. They kept saying they'd seen the Lord, eyes wide, voices breaking with wonder. And Thomas stood outside of it. With every retelling, the distance between their experience and his emptiness grew wider. They were in Sunday. He was still in Friday. How do you sit with someone else's certainty when your own grief is still unfinished? He wasn't asking for proof because he was stubborn. He'd been ready to die with Jesus, had witnessed or heard every detail of Friday. Now his closest friends were asking him to accept that death itself had been reversed, based on nothing but their excitement. Thomas wasn't looking for easy answers. He needed to see what resurrection had cost. That week in the locked room was almost unbearable. 10 men who'd witnessed something that transformed them forever, and one sitting apart, untouched by their revelation. Every morning someone tried again, insisting they'd seen Jesus, describing his hands and his side. And every morning, Thomas refused. What did those conversations actually look like? Did Peter grab him by the shoulders, trying to shake belief into him? Did John sit quietly beside him in the dark, hoping his presence would be enough? Or did they just keep pressing, the way people do when they can't understand why you won't accept what they're offering? The pity and frustration in their eyes might have been harder to bear than the doubt itself. Here's what nobody talks about. The 10 disciples believed because they saw. Jesus appeared, showed them his hands and side, and they believed. That's direct encounter, physical evidence, their own eyes. Thomas was asking for exactly the same thing they'd received, the same evidence, the same encounter. But when he asked for it, he became the doubter. There's a cruelty in that, maybe unintentional, but real. The people who believed through direct encounter were now demanding that Thomas believe because they told him to. They wanted him to build his faith on their experience, not his own. Secondhand certainty, borrowed conviction, and they couldn't understand why that wasn't enough for someone who'd been ready to die at his teacher's side. What's striking is that the 10 weren't exactly out proclaiming the resurrection either. They were still locked behind that same door, their belief real, but their fear just as present. They hadn't confronted the authorities or gone to the temple. Thomas wasn't the only one struggling. He was just the only one willing to say it out loud. But his demand wasn't random. Listen to what he actually said. Not just unless I see Jesus, but unless I see the nail marks, unless I put my finger where the nails were, unless I put my hand into his side. He wasn't fixated on a face. He was fixated on wounds. He'd been there on Friday, or close enough. He knew what Roman nails did to human flesh, what a spear through the ribs meant. So when he demanded to see those specific wounds, he was asking something far deeper than proof of life. Did the suffering survive the resurrection? Would the scars remain on the risen body, or would everything be smoothed clean as if Friday never happened? Thomas needed proof that the pain still mattered, that whatever came next didn't erase what it cost, He wasn't doubting faith itself. He was afraid of a faith that pretends nothing ever hurt. A week passes. Same room, same locked doors. But this time, Thomas is inside. Maybe exhaustion finally wore him down. Maybe the others' quiet persistence kept him tethered. Someone bringing bread, someone sitting beside him in silence when there was nothing left to say. Maybe he simply couldn't abandon the only people who shared his grief, even though their grief had transformed into something he couldn't recognize. Evening settles over Jerusalem. Oil lamps flicker against the stone walls, casting long shadows. The room fills with the low murmur of tired men, talk of provisions, someone adjusting the cloak against the chill. Just the ordinary sounds of frightened people marking another day behind a door they're afraid to open. Then, no warning, no knock, no sound of a door opening. Jesus is simply there, standing in the middle of the room, as if walls and locks and fear were nothing at all. Someone stumbles backward. A clay cup falls from the table and shatters against the stone floor. For a moment, that's the only sound. The air in the room shifts, warmer somehow, thicker. Something none of them can name fills the space between the stone walls. "Peace be with you," he says. The same words from a week ago, but this time his eyes don't sweep the room. They move slowly, deliberately, past Peter, past John, past every face, until they find Thomas and stay. Jesus doesn't start with a correction, no lecture, no "where is your faith?" No, "why couldn't you trust your friends?" He does something no one in the room expects. He goes directly to Thomas's demand, word for word. "Put your finger here," Jesus says, holding out his hands. The nail marks are visible in the lamplight, dark punctures in the flesh. Not healed smooth, not covered, not hidden, still there, permanent. "See my hands." Thomas stares at those hands, the same ones that broke bread at the last meal, that touched lepers and opened blind eyes, that pulled Peter from the water. Now they carry dark, permanent holes where iron spikes had been driven through. Jesus pulls his garment aside. "Reach out your hand and put it into my side." The wound from the Roman spear, the final confirmation of death on the cross, is visible. Not a faint scar, an opening. Everything Thomas has carried for 7 days collapses into this single moment. The hammer on iron, the gasping breath that grew slower until silence, Saturday's emptiness, his friends' hollow faces when they told him, the week of sitting between their joy and his emptiness, all of it funneled down to a man with open, wounded hands standing before him in a locked room, waiting. This is the moment the flash forward has been building toward. Thomas in a locked room, face to face with everything he demanded. His conditions, specific, physical, detailed, met completely. not argued away, not dismissed as faithless, met. But here's what the text actually says next. The Gospel of John never records Thomas touching. Jesus said, "Put your finger here." Jesus said, "Reach out your hand." But the text never describes Thomas reaching, never describes a finger entering a wound, never mentions contact of any kind. Instead, it captures 4 words: "My Lord and my God." The strongest declaration of faith in the entire Gospel of John. Not from Peter, who walked on water. Not from John, who leaned on Jesus' chest at supper. From Thomas, the doubter, the one who demanded proof, received everything he asked for, and then didn't need to use it. He didn't need to touch. Seeing the wounds was enough. But it wasn't just seeing Jesus alive that broke him open. It was seeing that the wounds remained. The nail marks hadn't healed. The spear wound hadn't closed. The risen body still carried every mark of Friday's suffering, held rather than erased. Thomas didn't need proof that someone had come back from the dead. He needed proof that the pain still mattered, that resurrection walks through suffering rather than around it, that the worst day wasn't obliterated by the best day, but transformed and carried forward, made permanent on a body that would never die again. Jesus' final words aren't a rebuke. They're a bridge, looking past Thomas, through the walls of that locked room, through centuries, to everyone who would hear this story and carry the same question. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. That blessing isn't a consolation prize. It's something far deeper. But notice what Jesus didn't do. He didn't shame Thomas for asking. He came back a second time, through locked doors, specifically for the one who wasn't there the first time. He opened his hands and showed every mark. Not with a lecture, but with wounds. And the man everyone called the doubter spoke the deepest truth in the entire gospel. My Lord and my God. No one else says those words. Not the one who doubted least, but the one who doubted most. In 1969, psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross published her landmark study on death and dying and changed how the world understands grief. But one of her lesser-known findings was about isolation. Grieving alone doesn't just slow the healing process, it distorts it entirely. Grief without community becomes something darker, heavier, and far more resistant to resolution. The mind turns inward, the questions multiply, and there's no one beside you to absorb the weight. Thomas lived this. During that first week, while the others huddled together behind locked doors, he processed the worst event of his life completely alone. By the time he returned, they'd already moved forward into joy. He was still trapped in Friday, not just emotionally separated, but experientially divided. They had seen something that rewrote everything. He hadn't. You've felt this. Maybe not with death, but with distance. Everyone at the service felt something move inside them, hands raised, tears falling, voices cracking with something you couldn't name. And you sat there with your hands in your lap, wondering what was wrong with you. Everyone came back from the retreat transformed. You came back exhausted, carrying the same questions you'd arrived with. The worst part isn't missing the experience. It's watching other people celebrate something you still can't reach. The drive home is the hardest part. Sitting in the back seat while people talk about what moved them, what shifted inside, while you stare out the window with the same weight you came with. You don't mention your silence because admitting you felt nothing in a room full of people who felt everything makes you the problem. So you learn to nod, to smile, to perform a certainty you don't possess. Thomas refused to do that. Brené Brown's research on vulnerability suggests that admitting uncertainty isn't weakness. It's the hardest form of courage. Standing in a room full of conviction and saying, "I'm not there yet," requires more strength than conforming. Thomas did exactly that. He held his honest position for a full week against the pressure of 10 people he loved, refusing to perform belief just to comfort them. In the 1950s, psychologist Solomon Asch ran a series of conformity experiments. He placed one participant in a room with actors who all gave obviously wrong answers to simple questions. Over 70% of participants eventually agreed with the group, not because they changed their minds, but because the social cost of standing alone was too high. Thomas held his ground for 7 days, against 10 people, and never folded. Religious communities sometimes respond to honest questions with suspicion. The person who asks, "How do I know this is real?" gets treated as a threat rather than someone doing the hardest work faith requires. Doubt gets labeled as lack of faith. Needing evidence gets called overthinking. Thomas has been receiving this treatment for 2,000 years. His name literally became a synonym for insufficient belief. But they got it backwards. Thomas's demand didn't weaken his faith. It produced the strongest declaration of faith in the entire gospel. His doubt was the doorway, not the obstacle. He asked the hardest question and gave the clearest answer: "My Lord and my God." No other disciple in John's account makes such an explicit statement. Church history shows Thomas traveled farther than any other apostle after that encounter. Not to nearby provinces or familiar cities, but east through Syria and Mesopotamia, across the Persian Empire, all the way to India's Malabar coast. He established churches that survived 2,000 years. The St. Thomas Christians of Kerala still trace their entire faith lineage to this one man. The apostle, branded as a doubter, became Christianity's most far-reaching missionary. His conviction, forged through questioning and direct encounter rather than inherited from the group, proved unshakable. Modern neuroscience confirms what his life demonstrated. Beliefs arrived at through personal struggle and first-hand experience create stronger, more lasting neural pathways than those passively absorbed. Thomas earned his faith, and it carried him to the edge of the known world. So what locked doors are you standing behind right now? What wounds do you need to see before you can move forward? What question are you afraid to ask? Not because you fear the answer, but because you're afraid of how the people around you will look at you for asking it. Thomas didn't believe because he stopped doubting. He believed because someone showed up in the middle of his doubt, with open hands and visible scars. Not with arguments, not with shame, but with presence. The wounds were still there, and that was enough. If you're standing behind a locked door right now, carrying questions you're afraid to voice, and a faith that doesn't feel like your own, the story doesn't end with trying harder. It ends with someone walking through that door, specifically for you. The only question is whether you'll still be in the room when it happens.